Hi, I'm Rick Bleiweiss, author of the Pignon, Scorpion, and the Barbershop Detectives Mystery Series. I'm an executive at Blackstone Publishing and the musical force behind Captain Rick's Retro Rocket Band. Welcome to Chapter and Verse. I'm here today with Rob Schwartz, whose father was the subject of the fabulous classic award-winning, probably #1 book, Tuesdays with Morrie. And before he passed, Morrie wrote a book, and I had the pleasure of publishing it called The Wisdom of Morrie, which Rob edited. And so I'm here with Rob Schwartz, Morrie's son. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Blackstone and you in particular for publishing The Wisdom of Morrie is much deeply appreciated.
Oh, my pleasure. It's the kind of a book I think everybody should read, especially as they age. And I think it was important to bring it to the masses, if you will. Before we start, I just want to read one quick thing, and it is the endorsement that Deepak Chopra gave to it. I would just like to start off by that. And Chopra said, "This is a beautiful book that shows that every moment of existence is precious and adversity is part of our life's journey. Those lucky enough to read this book will be inspired to higher consciousness in the midst of aging, infirmity, and the final chapters of life." And I just thought that was a fabulous quote from him.
Absolutely. He nailed it. There's a bunch of things in there that my father concentrated on that he absolutely got. And my father didn't want to write a book that was all roses and everything's cheery. As you age, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of adversity, and he wanted to meet them head on and say, you're don't expect everything to be easy.
Oh, I get it. So I know that you kind of discovered or rediscovered the manuscript in your dad's desk. So fill me in on that. I mean, exactly how did
Sure.
that come about?
Sure. I'll tell the story of rediscovering it, but let's tell the first thing. We have to move back another 14 years before that
All
to
right.
start with the very beginning of this story with me and dad. And this manuscript goes all the way back to 1989. I was a young pup and I had just finished a very long trip around Asia where I would later move to. I'd later move to Japan, but I had been traveling in China and Tibet and India and Thailand. And I had just gotten home and, put down my dusty backpack. And my father was in the midst of writing this book. So this is the summer of 1989. My father had basically just started and he was really consumed with it. He was emeritus at Brandeis University by this point. So he maybe was teaching one course a semester. So he had a lot of time and he wanted to bounce the ideas off me. We often talked about these kind of things. And so I talked to him a lot about this book and his ideas. And, he was writing it for maybe people, let's say, over 50, but he really wanted to hear how I responded to it as a young person. And, we had a lot of discussions about the book, and I saw his process for writing it and how he was thinking about it and what motivated him. And that was something that we shared. It was actually the last time that I lived at home for any appreciable amount of time. I think I lived at home for about 3 months before I moved to Japan. So then I moved to Japan and, 1990 and the years roll by. And then, of course, my father got ill, and all of that is described in Tuesdays with Morrie. Um, and after he passed, my mother kept his study the way it had been when he was alive, filled with books and, wall hangings, very, excuse me, very warm, sun streaming in and plants everywhere. So I'm a journalist. I used to sit at his desk and write my journalistic pieces. And one day I just pulled open a drawer of his desk and I found this big, thick, black bound thing. I mean, hardcover, not just flimsy pages, and really big, bigger than a normal book.
Okay.
And I opened it up and I was like, what is this? And I opened it up and I immediately realized what it was is this manuscript that my father had worked on from about 1989, 1988, 89 until about 1992, and actually had completed. And I had heard, him talk about it after we had had those experiences in 89, and he had, was in the editing process, but wasn't exactly sure. And this is a manuscript that's meant for everybody. It's, meant for the general public. He had never published anything like that before. All his previous books were academic books that were meant for a specific academic crowd and field of study. So, I rediscovered it and thought immediately, like, wow, now that Tuesdays with Morrie is published, and this is about 2002, we can do something with this book. But I realized that it was going to have to be edited, and it was going to be a long process to publish it. And I was living in Japan and had a pretty thriving journalistic career. So, it took a very long time to actually get it into print.
Wow. So what was it like reading it again? I mean, did you read it the first time when he wrote it, and then come back to it again, or was your first encounter when you found it?
I had not really read it at all, and certainly not read it cover to cover, because my father was writing it at that time. So most of the manuscript didn't exist, maybe one chapter, possibly two chapters. But no, this was the first time that I had read it, excuse me, cover to cover. And yeah, I mean, it was very exciting, because we're talking, at least 7 years after my father had passed, if not more. So, that's a fair amount of time. And his voice and his presence and his, understanding of the world and everything is just so clear in this book. It was really like it was, bringing him back into the room for me. I could hear his voice as I was reading the book, which is really a wonderful experience.
Oh, no, it sure was. Do you know what it was that made him want to write this book in the first place? Was it altruistic, or was it a summation of his life's thinking, or what was it?
Right. I think there was many things. There was some things that were specific and some things that were more general. I do think this is kind of a summation. He felt like it was a summation of his life's wisdom, and also of what he wanted to impart to the world, kind of like a magnum opus. If you read it, I think you'll get that impression too. And then specifically, this was a reaction to what he came to realize was a very significant amount of ageism in American society. And the reason why this was really driven home to him is my father was a professor at Brandeis University. A lot of people know that. He loved teaching. He loved students. He loved teaching. He loved being on campus. He loved talking to students and hanging out with them. People were always amazed that there was this 60-plus-year-old guy, and they could relate to him as if he was just another student on campus. He was very current with what was going on politically and culturally and things like that. I could tell you all sorts of stories about my father on campus. And when my father was 65, the university came to him and said, "Why don't you retire?" And he had no interest in retiring. So he said, "No, thank you." And when he was 67, the university came to him and said, "Why don't you retire?" And he said, "No, thank you." And when he was 70, which would be 1986, the end of 1986, so let's say early 1987, the university came to him and said, "You will retire." They forced him to retire. This doesn't exist anymore on university campuses, but at that time in the 80s, it did. So they forced him to retire, and he realized it was absurd. He was a perfectly capable teacher, maybe even more so than he'd ever been. He was perfectly coherent and cognizant and loved his students, and they loved him, but he was forced to retire. So that forced him to confront this ageism that we have in our society. And just like all the other isms that are so poisonous, sexism and racism, he thought that ageism was equally poisonous, and no one talks about it. The idea that someone who's over a certain age is experiencing discrimination and should be defended, that just doesn't, or maybe it does today, but at that time just didn't enter into people's thinking. It's like, you're old, we're going to push you aside, and nobody thought there was anything wrong with that. Nowadays, maybe we have a slightly different thinking. But this book was written by my father in, the immediate sense to address this ageism and to address the idea that, we're just going to push you aside at a certain point. And it's really filled with, as you know, with stories and newspaper articles and all sorts of things that are trying to show you, like, age is not a barrier and is not something that defines somebody. And if somebody is capable of doing a job or doing something, you shouldn't worry about their age. And it's really one of the things in the book is really trying to make an impression upon people that you really need to disregard age when it comes to determining how capable somebody is.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, on the cover, the subtitle is Living and Aging Creatively and Joyfully. And describe for people who are watching this where the creativity creatively comes in, because joyfully, obviously, you can live joyfully. And where does the creativity come in?
Well, I mean, I think my father would say it's absolutely part and parcel of a full and, meaningful life is to be creative. And it's a really long answer or really short answer, depending on how you look at it, to your question. I mean, I think my father would say that creativity is crucial in our lives. Now, what you create, it can be something very concrete, like writing a book, or it can be something very abstract, like thinking about things in your own life, or creating new relationships, or creating a new aspect, or extending an aspect of a relationship you have, or creating a new pathway. If you file, the creation is an open-ended thing, but it's absolutely necessary, according to my dad, and if you read this book, to push forward, to create new things, to keep challenging yourself, to keep thinking about widening your world. And he gives lots of techniques on how to try and do this, and that's the thing that I really love about this book. There's a lot of stories and poetry and newspaper articles and imagery, but there's also very straightforward techniques. I mean, I don't like to describe this book as a self-help book, but it has that aspect to it, like concrete things that you can do to try and remain, joyous and creative in life.
Yes. Diverting a little bit from the book, how did Mitch Albom meet up with your dad to create Tuesdays with Morrie in the first place? Do you know?
Okay, I think that story is pretty well known, but I'll certainly tell it briefly for you.
Oh.
So the brief story is Mitch Albom was a student of my dad's in the 70s. He graduated in 1979. I think he was a sociology major. Maybe he was a double major because he wanted to play music. He wanted to be a professional musician. And he was a favorite student of my dad's. They had a very strong relationship, not only in the classroom, but outside. And he gave my father a gift on graduation day, which is described in Tuesdays with Morrie, and promised to stay in touch. And he no contact whatsoever for 16 years. And then he saw my dad on the Nightline news program, which was very popular in the 90s and still on TV, maybe not as important today as it was in the 90s. Ted Koppel is no longer the host, but he saw Dad on that program, a program which my father appeared 3 times, which was unusual in itself. But in any case, he saw him, he learned that Dad had ALS and that he was basically dying, and he decided he needed to reach out to my father and at least say thank you for everything. And he called him, and basically Dad said, like, why don't you come and see me? And there's a lot of little intricacies and coincidences, if you like, which really make this story fascinating and is just such a part of life. So Mitch might not have come to Boston because he was a very successful sports journalist. You probably know this. He was like a very awarded, heralded sports journalist. He would have been very busy. But at this specific time, when he made the phone call to my father, his newspaper was on strike. So he didn't have to work as much. Yes, his newspaper was on strike. And get this, not only was his newspaper on strike, but he was appearing regularly on an ESPN show called The Sports Reporters, which was filmed on Monday night in Connecticut. in
Close to
Connecticut.
Boston, right?
Exactly, close to Boston. So all Mitch had to do on Tuesday was drive from Connecticut to Boston, which isn't that far a drive, right? If he had been in Detroit, might have been
Right.
different, might not have been a Tuesday that he came. I mean, in the book, he highlights, oh, Tuesday was our day. But it was
Right.
very serendipitous that he happened to be recording the sports reporters on Monday night, and he drove to Boston the Tuesday afterwards, and they met. And Mitch, as he describes in Tuesdays with Morrie, sort of dawned on him. It's like, okay, I need to maybe meet this guy more than once. Maybe there's something here that I can learn. Or, after that, you need to ask Mitch exactly why he made the decision he did.
How did you feel about Tuesdays with Morrie? I mean, it was your dad. Did you thought he was represented well? Do you think it was good? Did you parts of it
That's
you didn't
also
like?
a very long answer. I'll try and condense it because there's so many different aspects to it. I mean, fundamentally, it was an incredible revelation for us, incredible blessing to get my father's, wisdom and words and thoughts out to the general public on such a massive scale. And there's a lot of serendipitous points that go along with that. I mean, when Mitch released the book, it was not a bestseller.
Oh, really?
It took a very special person discovering the book. I'm going to quiz you now. You'll probably get it. It took a very special person discovering the book, and this person was so powerful that they put it on their, book of the month club or whatever it was, book list, and brought Mitch on their show, and then it jumped to #1. And that person was
Oprah Winfrey.
correct. Oprah Winfrey. Because of Oprah Winfrey, Tuesdays with Morrie jumped to #1 on the
Wow.
best. I mean, we can just say that categorically because of Oprah Winfrey. So, yeah, absolutely. We were overjoyed. I was overjoyed. The whole family was overjoyed. And yes, I felt the book portrayed my father and his thoughts very well. Now, Mitch wrote this book in a very specific way, right? Nobody's going to have to look up any words in the dictionary in this
No.
book, right?
Right.
It's written for everybody, very straightforward, very direct, very slim volume, but captures my father very, very well. But I think the next part of what I'll explain is true for any public figure, right? Any public figure has who the public perceives them to be and who they really are. And it's
Right.
never going to be exactly the same thing. There's always going to be a difference, a divergence from those two things. So it was so fascinating, usually amusing, sometimes a little bit irritating for people in the general public just to assume that they knew my dad, because the book feels so personal. It
Yes.
feels so intimate,
Yes.
So people would just assume that they knew my dad. And we got not only with Tuesdays with Morrie, but also with Nightline. Even when my father was alive, we got hundreds of letters. And of course, there's a scene in Tuesdays with Morrie where my father is responding to people has written him letters. That's actually my big cameo in the book. But anyway, we got letters after my father passed, after Tuesdays with Morrie was published. And I should note that my father never read a word of Tuesdays with Morrie.
Oh,
Mitch
really?
didn't start writing it until after my father passed away.
Okay.
But we got hundreds of letters, and most of them were absolutely beautiful and heartfelt and so touching. But lots of people would assume that they knew more about my father than they actually did. And I think it is important to keep that sort of general persona so people can what's the word, project their own thing onto it, because we want the words to affect them as much as possible, because
Right.
they're full of understanding and love. So if somebody is a devout Christian and they see that in what my father has to say, and I think you can easily see that, that's
Yes.
fine. That's great. Even if my father wasn't Christian, nor would have ever considered being Christian, or if somebody had told him, your teachings are whatever Christian, he might have reacted against that. It's not the point. People can project what they want onto it as long as it's something positive and loving and accepting of people, which is the message, one of the messages of the book.
Rob, the core, I think, at the basis of every religion is love. So it is universally transferable from one religion to another when that's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that's correct. I mean, I think history and philosophy of religion might be another topic. I did
Right.
actually study philosophy in university, so we could go down that road. But yeah, I think that that's probably true. And I think in this specific case, we're talking about, someone who had never been in the public eye, or not exactly true. He had been very minorly in the public eye. He had
Right.
done speaking tours and stuff, but nothing like this. And so people can bring their own ideas to the book, but also read the book and take what it's offering. So yeah, to answer your question, fundamentally we were absolutely overjoyed with the book. Mitch and my mother became very, very close. I mean, they were close when my father was alive, but they became very close after he passed, and fiercely defended each other,
Wow.
and were fiercely protective of each other. Mitch
Oh,
was
that's good.
fiercely protective of my mother, and my mother was fiercely protective of him. Lots of examples of that I can give you if you like. Mitch was extremely
Give me
generous to
one.
my mother.
Can you give me one?
Um, okay, this relates, there's a callback to a previous story. When
Okay.
Oprah put the Tuesdays with Morrie on her Book of the Month Club and had Mitch on her show, she's a very shrewd lady.
Oh,
She
yes.
bought the rights to make a movie, and
Oh,
her production company, which is called Harpo, Oprah
right.
backwards, her production company mainly did TV movies. So it was
Right.
a made for TV movie. Starred big stars, Jack Lemmon, who won a Golden Globe for it, and Hank Azaria, but it was a made for TV movie. When they were making the movie, Oprah, I can't remember exactly what the parameters were, but basically one person could make changes in the script. And Mitch gave that privilege to my mother.
Oh,
He
wow.
said, "You can change anything you want in the script. I won't have any say in it if you do this." And so my mother was an academic as well, and an editor, which I write about in my essays about my mom and dad. And she, studied the script and made suggestions, and, things that she didn't want said or didn't want portrayed. She basically doesn't appear in the movie at all, and that's
Okay.
how she won. I mean, there is a woman portraying her, but basically very, very few scenes, very, very few lines, and that's how she wanted it.
Well, I must admit, I've read the book, Tuesdays with Morrie, more than once, but I have never seen the movie.
Uh,
Was the movie pretty true to the book?
as you might be able to guess, being in media,
Yeah.
they changed a lot. It was a TV movie. They felt, that they had to ratchet up the drama. So there are a bunch of things that they invented for the
Oh,
movie that they
okay.
added. I can tell you two of them off the top of my head.
Sure.
They made Mitch have a big tension and fight with his newspaper. So, big drama. So he needs to ask my father for advice about this. They made Mitch, in her relationship with the woman who in the movie would be his wife, Janine, but in reality they were already married for I don't know, at least they were already married. So
Okay.
in the movie, he has to come to my father and ask him advice. Should I marry this woman? In fact, they were already married. So
Okay.
there's 2 points where they invented things to try and invent drama or tension, that were not real. Yeah.
Okay.
And the for made from TV movie, you're going to do that,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
talking about things that are real, one of the things I love about Wisdom of Morrie is that it is told by Morrie in Morrie's words. And
Yes.
to that point, how much editing did you have to do? I mean, here you come upon this manuscript, and since I published it, I know you put some significant editing into it. What was that like?
Right. So I guess it's two questions. How much editing did I do and what was it like? So the first question is there was a lot of editing involved. But I'll say that with the caveat that my number one focus in editing the book, as you alluded to, is to maintain my father's voice. So that was always in the forefront of my mind. I need to maintain my father's voice while editing this book. But secondarily, we have to remember this book was written over a fairly long period of time, 3 or 4 years. It could even be from 1988 to 1992. And essentially, no one had edited it. So there was repetition. There was things where my father forgot he had talked about something already. There was all sorts of things. There was paragraphs that need to be cleaned up. There was large sections of the book, or not large sections, but there were sections of some chapters. There was repetitive. So in that way, there was a lot of editing that needed to be done, and there was a lot of things that needed to be cleaned up. So yes, it was a lot of work, and it clearly needed, editing. It wasn't like when he had written it, it was ready to go to press. Not at all. What was it like? It was a joyous experience, but it was also a lot of work because it's, a fairly long book. And as I write about in my essays, my mother and father worked together as academics, and my mother was essentially my father's editor. And when I decided I was going to take on this project, my first resource was my mother, because she had edited a lot of my father's writings, both books and even articles that he had published in different academic journals, etc. So I talked to her, and we discussed how to edit it and what to do with it. And I talk about that. As you know, I wrote 2 essays, one at the beginning and one at the end. And I talk a lot about my mother and how she was able to give me insight into, what some of the weaknesses might be or something like that. And it was very, very useful. Other parts, were super enjoyable. I added here and there, very few. I added some subtitles or something like that. And I really had to get into my mind to my father. He forgot to put a title on a section or something. So I had to write one. And, in addition to having talked to him a lot about the book, as I said, I studied philosophy. My father was extremely philosophical, as you can guess from these 2 books, and he was a professor of sociology. So we talked a lot about different philosophers, different thinkers throughout our life. This was something that was a constant conversation between he and I. So I had an idea of how he thought about things, which philosophers and thinkers had impressed him that, was part of his way of thinking. So I drew from that in editing the book. When I'll leave you with one last thought. When I discovered the manuscript, I had long talks with my mother, and she told me she's glad that I was taking on this project. And she told me, you're the only person who could do this editing, who could bring this book to fruition. So, that made me feel good, and I tried to fulfill that task. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely should. So your dad coined the term age casting.
Ooh.
You want to explain what exactly he meant?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a term that he coined basically from Hollywood and from movies, because my father loved movies, as do I, and some people may know I'm also a film critic and film producer. Um, and in the film world, we have the term typecasting, right? When an actor is typecast, it means they're forced into one type of role. This is the only thing you can do. You can only play the bad guy. You can only play the best friend. You can only play the schlemiel, right? You can't play the handsome lead. These things are forced upon actors. Most good actors can do any role if you ask them to, even if they're not classically handsome. They can play the lead with a certain panache that would make it their own, right? But that's generally not the way Hollywood has worked. And age casting is the same thing. Simply because somebody reaches a certain age, you push them into a certain role. And in this case, that role is just standing on the sidelines and doing nothing. And my father was so appalled and, saddened by this, that he felt we had to isolate this phenomena and give it its own term. And I certainly hope this term comes to be used widely. Age casting is when you push people above a certain age, whatever age that is. It could be as young as 50 or 55 or as old as, 100, who knows, into a certain role simply because of their age, with no thought to how competent they are, how, intellectually sharp they are, what have you. So that's the term that my father created. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, in your words, the Wisdom of Morrie book, would you say that it's geared to aging people? Would you say it's geared to younger people, helping them through the entirety of their life, all of the above? How do you see the focus of the book?
Um, it's a bit of a tricky question because certainly my father wrote it with aging people in mind. I think he was aiming it at people over 50. But I think, and I've heard from a lot of people who are much younger than that it's extremely helpful for them. And I think the ideas and the suggestions and the wisdom that my father is putting forward can help anybody of any age. So it's kind of a dual answer. In one sense, the book is aimed at people who are aging, and there's a lot of specific things about that. He talks about, oh, if you're retired now or something like that. But on the other hand, there's so much in there, and all of the straightforward techniques that I mentioned earlier, they can be applied to a person of any age. They are not dependent on being elderly or having that experience at all. So I think the book can basically help everybody. I'll add an addendum to that, of just a footnote, is that um, I felt I had to be true to my dad he wrote this book for aging people. So I felt like we couldn't ignore that when we published. Despite the fact that it can help everybody, we had to at least, allude to that and in some way make people understand that was what my father thought. But I think, yes, the book can absolutely help everybody of any age. And, I've heard from younger people that it's been extremely helpful for them.
So if we have somebody watching who is aging, an older, a senior, I'm a senior, I mean, um, can you when I would say come up with, explain, can you elucidate one or two specifics on what the book suggests to an aging person to be able to live a more creative and vibrant life?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is the didactic part of the interview. Bam, bam, bam. I'll give you all five. And of course, this is not didacticism in the sense of you must do this. This is didacticism in the sense of if this helps you, run with it. If it
Right.
doesn't help you, discard it. Right. But these are sort of the 5 points. Let's see if I can remember the 5 points that my father lays out in the book. Some of them, and there's some are from very specific to very wide. So we'll start specific and we'll go wide. So the first two things are kind of not exactly in opposition to each other, but they feel like there's an opposition there. The first thing my father sort of noticed, because he talked to a lot of people who were aging, a lot of retired people, read a lot of, about it. And he felt that a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people as they age sort of become dour and, too serious. So he said that one of the most important aspects of life that makes life worth living is laughter. So
Mhm.
it's so important to laugh as much as you can, to find what what you consider humorous and what tickles your funny bone and indulge in it, whether that's comedy movies or stand-up comedy or whatever it is,
Right.
comics or whatever it is. So he thought that laughter was extremely important and that you should indulge in laughter as much as you possibly can, especially face to face with people who make you laugh, who
Right.
entertain you. That's number one. Number two, considerably opposite, my father was a lifelong advocate of meditation. And there have been a lot of studies that show the actual health benefits of meditation. There have been a couple of studies. I think one was done quite a long time ago, meaning about still long after my father passed, about 15 years ago, an academic study that showed on average people who meditate live something like 5 to 7 years longer than people who don't meditate. So I don't know how they did a controlled group for that. I don't know how that study was uh, was done, but I remember reading it. And so my father thought it was extremely important to meditate. It calms you down, focuses your energy, all of the benefits of meditation that people talk about, my father was very enthusiastic about. And there's a lot of misunderstanding of meditation. Meditation doesn't mean you have to sit in the chair for an hour, right? That is extremely difficult. And if beginners try and do that, they're going to get discouraged right away. You can literally meditate for 3 minutes. You know, if that's your ritual, you can meditate for 3 minutes. And there's different types of meditation. People think that meditation means that you have to have a completely blank mind. That's not true at all. Meditation means you have to try and concentrate on something. It can be your breath, it can be some sound, which we call a mantra, but naturally your mind is going to wander. Oh, did I feed the cat? Oh, is my, partner coming home at a certain time? What you're supposed to do, what meditation teachers explain, is that you should recognize that thought. Oh, now I'm thinking about my partner. Let it go. Go back to the meditation that you're doing. Another thought is going to wander into your brain, hopefully not immediately, but don't be discouraged by the fact that your brain continues to think. It's the idea of meditation is to try and calm that inner dialogue, but it's not easy. And you shouldn't get discouraged if you can't do it immediately, or, if you continue to have these thoughts. The idea is to let them go and continue to meditate. So that's the second one. And of course, as you well know, a tremendous amount has been written about meditation. There's many different styles of meditation. My father is not prescribing what style of meditation you should do, right? He's just saying the concept, the practice of it is very good and will help you in many ways that you'll discover once you start doing it. Right. The third thing, and this is somewhat related to meditation, but now we're getting wider, is my father felt that you really needed to concentrate your energy. People are always thinking about 1,000 different things, trying to do 1,000 different things. He felt, and this is the point when it was a little bit more aimed at retired people, but you don't have to be retired to take this advice on board. He felt that, like retired people, you could forget about all the extraneous things and concentrate on what's important to you. Well, what is important to you? My father has some suggestions on that. He thinks that the relationships in our lives are the most important thing. He thinks that our relationships with other people is what gives our lives meaning. I mean, it could be a relationship if you're an artist with your art or something like that, but more or less, it's the relationship with other people. So he thinks that you should concentrate on those things, that you should take care of them, that you should nurture them, continue to build them up. I mean, this isn't, huge news to people who have a partner. Of course, you feel you should concentrate on your partner. That part is obvious, though some people forget that it's so important. But also your friends, your other relatives, these relationships, my father felt, were extremely important. So this is actually 2 things, 2 points. Concentrate your energies and concentrate or continue to nurture your personal relationships in your life, the people in your life. They're 2 points that go together, but they're, not exactly the same thing. When he says like concentrate your energy, he also means figure out what's really important to you or what really interests you. My father felt that a lot of people never really figure out what's interesting to them. They enter a job that somehow they get shuttled into. It may be a good living, it may be not such a good living, but they do it for 60 years or 30 years or 40 years. And then, they're at a point in their life where it's like, I'm tired, I stop working, but they never really concentrate on what interests me, what turns me on, and whatever it is, really dive into it. I think some people anyways, do this naturally, right? When you have more free time, you get really interested in whatever it is, travel or art or a different culture or a different language or whatever it is. My father suggests you isolate what really interests you. So concentrate on that as the third point that we made and develop it. And you can also, this plays into the fourth point, if you develop that, you can also meet new people through that interest and develop new relationships. He thought it was really important to stay open to the world, develop new relationships, and of course, and continue to nurture your previous relationships. So those are 4 or maybe 5 things. And then the bonus one, and this one is very abstract and is very much open to personal interpretation, but it's still something that my father thought was very important, which is that you develop some sort of spiritual connection in your life, whatever the spiritual connection means to you. If it's an organized, established religion that connects you to the spirit, if you use that word, or God, if you use that word, fantastic. If it's a completely personal idea of what spirituality is, that that you have independently, that's perfectly fine too. If it's somewhere in between those two, that's fine. Whatever spirituality means to you, that you develop that connection to something greater than yourself. Let's put it that way. And that was extremely important to my father, especially at the end of his life. But throughout the years,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you obviously knew your dad well. You've certainly known him even better through his writings. It's expanded your knowledge of him as a human. What is your feeling about how he would feel about society today?
Wow. I mean, as you know, we released this book in 2023, and I answered that question a lot, both from the audience and from interviewers. And I mean, I'm going to give you a similar answer that I gave in 2023, but it's just amplified 1,000 times, without getting too political. My father would be pretty dismayed by the society that we have today and the political situation that we have today for many different reasons, but particularly because things are so divided. We have 2 sides, and the division is just getting deeper and deeper and seems to be more entrenched, and impossible to bridge this divide, and this would be deeply upsetting to him. He felt that what connected us and what it brought us together as human beings, as people on this planet, or even as Americans, was so much greater than what divides us. And everybody knows, if you meet somebody face to face and you meet them with an open heart, without any preconceptions like, oh, if they believe this, then I'm going to try and change their mind, or I'm going to shout at them. If you put that aside and you meet them with an open heart about what's important to them, and the other person also has an open heart, even if they have different political views than you or different views about life, you're going to get along just fine, and you're actually going to like each other and care about each other, because that's human nature.
Right.
At least that is my father's perspective on it. Other people may disagree, but that is my father's perspective on it. That essentially, as humans, we were all the same. We all deep down have the same values. We want to love. We want to be loved. We want to have a connection to other people, as we just talked about in the techniques to keep you joyous and creative. And yeah, my father would be extremely dismayed that we have such a divided and even acrimonious society at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's with the what's going on with all of the major telescopes that are out in space now, and with the images that are coming back of the universe, and then when you kind of see this little blue orb that's Earth just kind of floating in space, I just wonder if people that lived on Earth, humans, if they all were able to go up into a spaceship and view the Earth from afar, if their view of what was going on here wouldn't be different than it is.
Yeah, I think it certainly would be. I mean, this is specifically the problem, that is not only just going, to space, but people have such a narrow view. They're so entrenched in their life and their values. If you can widen your view, even just by traveling and meeting people, you realize that all people are the same. I mean, we have different traditions, we have different cultures, but essentially, deep down, all people are the same. And this was a huge philosophical point of my father. What connects us is so much greater and so much stronger than what divides us. And
Yes.
when you really get into it, and we've seen so many stories like this of life-threatening situations or something like that, then you realize what connects us is so much greater and stronger and more important than these things that you think divide us, you know?
Yes. And talking about connections, I know your dad was really into interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
So, what do you think his view on social media would be? Because social media is on one way that, and on the other hand, it's a divider of people because it doesn't get them out of their house and actually meeting people often.
Right, right. Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I think my father would have, a divided opinion about it. It's amazing that we can connect with people all across the world, and I regularly do on,
Right. Me
conferencing
too. Yeah.
apps and social media apps. I am regularly talking to people. I mean, I lived in Asia for many, many years. I'm regularly talking to people in Asia. I'm regularly talking to people in Africa and, other parts of the world as well. But on the other hand, as you say, it also serves to divide us, to keep people in their house or staring at their phone and not talking to the person who's right in front of them. So it's a dual situation. And, in some ways it's good and in some ways it's bad. Certainly social media in terms of, the social discourse has become incredibly poisonous. And my father would recognize that. And I think that, and now we're straying onto a little bit political turf, but um, I think my father, who was a very political person, would say that social media has become a tool of foreign actors to
Yeah.
influence this country, and they've been very successful in
Yeah.
doing so. And this is, a extremely harmful situation. And this isn't something that anybody expected when we created the net and we started to use it,
Oh,
but it
yeah.
is absolutely something that's happened. And I think that my father would be very much commenting on that.
Did your dad have hobbies that aren't generally known to the public, or was
Yes, there's one, and it's really, really ironic. And I kind of a little bit hesitant to bring it up, but I will because this one involves Mitch. So, first of all, as I said, Mitch has been incredibly generous and important for our family, and we owe him so much. We all feel this incredible debt of gratitude. I mean, it
right?
chokes me up just to think how much this guy has done for my family. But Mitch also wrote a play
Ah,
called Tuesdays with Morrie, which is performed regularly around the country and around the world. I could tell you all kinds of stories about me doing Q&A after the play in international countries and in the United States. And
oh,
in
cool.
fact, I'm going to give a little shout out to the next time I'm going, though I don't know the name of the theater company, but it's in Greenville, South Carolina, and they're putting on the play in April, and I am going to appear on the last days of the play afterwards to do a Q&A to give some insight into my actual father. So Mitch wrote this play, and with plays, you want to rack it up the tension with theater. So Mitch was a sports writer. So in this play, he portrays that my father doesn't know anything about sports. The opposite is actually the truth. My
Oh,
father was a great sports enthusiast. He took me to many sporting events. Some of my most vivid memories as a child, and we're from Boston, so
yes.
about Boston. Some of my most vivid memories as a child are going to Fenway Park, watching the Red Sox play, going to Boston Garden, watching the Celtics play with my dad back in the day when you could get tickets to these events very easily. My father loved tennis. I'm going to throw this out there. I doubt that he'll watch, but if he did, I watch tennis myself all the time. As we know, John McEnroe is now a commentator. My father loved John McEnroe. He loved his game. He didn't love his temper and his temper tantrums, but he loved his tennis game. He loved his athleticism. And someday I would love to tell John McEnroe how much my father loved his game and his athleticism. So, I mean, off the top of my head, those were probably his three favorite sports: basketball, baseball, and tennis. We also watched other sports, not so much hockey, but football and other sports as well. But those three, and I have tremendous number of memories from childhood. My father also really enjoyed the beach. He actually went to many Caribbean nations. We had 2 vacations in Puerto Rico as kids. This is before people regularly went to Puerto Rico.
Right.
I know that my father also traveled to Guadeloupe before I was born, and the Bahamas. I think there was other Caribbean trips in there. He loved the beach, and we used to go to Cape Cod, not every single summer, but almost every single summer. We used to split our time. We would go to camp in Vermont, and then we would go to the beach in Cape Cod, and we would sit on the beach with the best friend or one of the best family friends who I could actually talk about as well because they are public figures. One of them is a very controversial public figure, actually. I'll throw it out there just because I don't think I've ever
Sure.
talked about this in public. My mother's roommate in graduate school was a woman named Anita Arrow, who married a economist, and she was an economist. Anita Arrow was an economist, married an economist named Bob Summers, who then was named Anita Summers. One of their sons, you may recognize the name, is Larry Summers.
Yeah.
So quite a well-known public figure. He has
Yeah.
2 other brothers, Ricky and Johnny, and John now. And we all hung out together, and they used to get a house on the Cape, and we would go every summer and hang out with them. So it's an interesting connection. My mother was at Larry's inauguration as president of Harvard, ill-fated term as president of Harvard. But in any case, so, a very well-known figure. But the point is, you asked me about hobbies of my father. So he
Right.
loved the beach. He went swimming practically every day, not at the beach, but in a swimming pool. He used to go to the YMCA to swim to stay fit. He was extremely fit his whole life, which is why we were kind of shocked when he started having health problems. So yeah, those would be the hobbies that I would point to: watching sports and swimming and going to the beach. I mean, of course, he loved reading and discovering new things and had incredibly wide, eclectic tastes. And that really, transferred to me. He read a lot of Eastern thinkers, and I, moved to Japan when I was, whenever 23, 24, what have you, you know. So, but to answer your question, those are his main hobbies, I think.
Okay. Well, we're getting toward the end of this. I know that you've called Tuesdays with Morrie and the Wisdom of Morrie bookends. Do you want to explain that and add
Sure.
any last thoughts on the Wisdom of Morrie?
Sure, sure. Yeah, it's also, as with many things in life, quite an irony. There's a lot of irony between these 2 books, because one of them, Tuesdays with Morrie, is a very slim, very, direct volume. And the other, The Wisdom of Morrie, is very, expository, a lot of writing. My father throws a lot of things in there, and he does it in purpose. He wants you to read stories and read newspaper articles and read poetry about what he's trying to express to you. So the communication styles of the 2 books are almost like opposites, but they're communicating the same message. So that's an irony. Another irony is Tuesdays with Morrie was written and was immediately published, and of course, a gigantic success. The Wisdom of Morrie was written before Tuesdays with Morrie, but published afterwards, and took a really long time to come into the public view. So we have these opposites in 2 volumes, which are essentially talking about the same ideas and trying to express the same insights into life.
Well, cool. Well, I'm going to hold it up again because it's really an important book, The Wisdom of Morrie. It's important to seniors. It's important to just anyone that wants to get creativity and joy in their life. And Rob, I thank you both for finding it, editing it, and bringing it to us and bringing it to the world.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, I don't think it probably goes without saying, but it was an extreme pleasure and joy of mine to be able to publish this book that my father worked on so hard and really felt was like his magnum opus. and his life work. And if it had never been published, it would have been a tremendous shame. So I feel a large amount of satisfaction getting it out in the public. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, I'm really grateful to Blackstone for stepping up and publishing it, and taking such an interest in it. And I have to talk about it because I'm so happy with it. As you'll well remember, I had a lot of ideas, artistic ideas about what the book should look like, and Blackstone was very open to those ideas. We have a very colorful volume that has all kinds of things that you won't find in a normal book. Different typefaces, colors running through it. There's all kinds of family photos in there. Parts of it seem like they're handwritten. Not my father's handwriting, which was illegible, but parts of it seem like trying to engage the reader and show that this is something really personal, in addition to being something philosophical and something universal.
Yes, and for anybody that has not read the book, it is written in a very easy to read style. I mean, it's not a book where you're going to have to be running to the dictionary every other word. You're not going to go, oh my God, what does he mean by that concept? It's really got great advice, and it's simple and complex at the same time.
Right, and that's another irony, is that my father was a professor and he wrote all these academic books before this, some of which I talk about in my essay, which actually have a thread which runs through them, which continues into this book. But this book is written in a very direct, very, everyday style, communicating to everybody, and not at all in an academic style. So, very much something that every person can read.
All right, one last question. How did you like living in Japan? Because I used to consult to a company in Japan and absolutely loved the country. What was your feeling?
We're over an hour here. If you want to go into a second hour, I mean, obviously, I could give you a very long answer. I'll try and break it
down. Give me the short answer.
Shorter answer.
Shorter.
So the thing that I usually tell people, and you'll probably understand this, is that Japan is fascinating in the sense that everything, or almost everything, let's say, most everything that's good about the country, you can understand almost immediately. Not immediately, but almost immediately. Let's say being there a few weeks. And not everything that's good. There's some complex things, but essential things that are good about Japan. People are so incredibly polite. People are so sweet and so gentle. And the place is run so immaculately well. All the trains run incredibly on time. Everything seems so incredibly efficient and clean and peaceful and, non-violent and non-confrontational. All those things are true. And all of those things you can probably realize and experience within a week of Japan. All the things that are difficult and even ugly and disheartening and cruel about Japan take you years and years and years and years of living there and being part of the culture and observing it to uncover. And I can talk about those things. People are really shocked when I say that. Is this part of society? It's like, yes, no society is perfect. Japan sacrifices a lot to have that social harmony. Now, maybe you can argue they don't have to sacrifice a lot and all of these things that they have, but there is a lot of very, very ugly things. And in fact, just today, I've started a new column. I wrote about Japanese film as one of my pursuits in Japan. I also wrote about the music industries of Asia, and particularly Japan. But I had a film column in Japan for 25 years, and I just started a new one. And my first piece is about a documentary called Black Box Diaries, which has been nominated for Best Documentary Feature for an Academy Award. And it's a woman named Shiori Ito, who was a journalist, who is describing and writing about and talking about the aftermath of her rape by a very powerful journalist in Japan who has ties, or had ties, let's say, to very powerful people. and how he was never arrested for his crimes, despite the fact there's a tremendous amount of evidence. You can read my article on that in the AU Review, letter AUreview.com. And it's also nominated for an Academy Award. So you can see it around. I think it's streaming on Paramount Plus. So you can stream it if you want. But if you just look up the Black Box Diaries, you can find it. Not only is it a documentary, the Black Box Diaries documentary is based on a book of the same name by Shiori Ito that was translated by a good friend of mine named Allison Markin Powell. And so you can read her book if you prefer to read the book as opposed to watch the documentary. But just briefly, I mean, this is uncovering a very difficult aspect of Japanese society where there is a lot of sexual assault, which goes unaddressed. Japan is extremely low on the world chart of equality of the sexes. Extremely low for how developed a society it is and how powerful their economy is. I think it's something like 125th when their economy is third in the world. So there are some social problems in Japan which people don't like to talk about, and that is a Japanese thing not to talk about them, and that's kind of part of the problem. But as I said, it's an incredibly wonderful place if you're not involved in any of those problems to wander around. And I should add, I mean, I feel like I'm talking a little bit too much about this, but I should add that this is not a warning for tourists. That is not the kind of sexual assault that exists in Japan. There's practically no chance that you would get attacked on the street. Sexual assault in Japan is what we call date rape, is people who know each other and get involved in situations that are dangerous for them. As a society, Japan is extremely safe, as most people know. And the idea that a tourist would be in any way assaulted is, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. So that's not what I'm talking about. I don't want to discourage anyone from visiting Japan. It's a wonderful place to visit. And, you know, in some ways, it's the best place to visit because people are so polite, it's so clean, it's so safe, the culture is so fascinating, the food is fantastic. And right now, it's incredibly cheap. The yen is so weak that it's about the same price as going to Thailand or Mexico or someplace like that. It's crazy how, and Japan is therefore inundated with tourists right now.
When I said I was consulting to Columbia Entertainment, a record company in Japan for a couple of years. My wife came with me on a couple of the trips, and she just went all over by herself. There was never any issues. People were just polite. They were caring. But an interesting quick story, because you're talking about how what you see initially and what might be in the undertow, if you will, can be different. So I was attending a marketing meeting at this record company, and before the meeting, one of the executives there told me about an idea he had, which was a very creative, I thought, brilliant idea. And the marketing meeting goes on, and his idea is never verbalized. And so after the meeting, I said to him, why didn't you bring that up? And he said, because we have a saying in Japan that the nail that stands the tallest gets hammered down the hardest. And he said, and people here are very reticent to offer opinions. It was an interesting learning experience.
Yeah, it's exactly correct. It's a well repeated idiom or phrase in Japan. Usually it's the nail that stands out gets hammered down. And that's exactly right. Like, people don't want to stand out. They don't want to offer opinions. And because of that, Japan is incredibly slow to change in all sorts of ways. It also means the power structure in Japan goes unchallenged no matter what they do, including a powerful journalist committing sexual assault. There was recently a story, I mean, I feel bad now for my Japanese friends talking about this, but there was recently a story in the Japanese press, I mean, this is like 4 days ago, of a Japanese politician committing sexual assault against a 12-year-old girl and being found guilty in the court of law and getting a suspended sentence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Not suffering any punishment from it, essentially.
But I do agree with what you said earlier. All of that notwithstanding, as an American tourist, it is a place I would go back to in a
Oh,
heartbeat.
it's one of the best places in the world to visit, without a doubt. And I mean, we could even talk about, since you mentioned Columbia Records, I can talk about the Japanese music industry. I'll just throw it out there because it's going to be so shocking to people. Even today, the majority of revenue from recorded music in Japan comes from CD sales, not from streaming. It's the
Yeah.
only market in the world because they refuse to change. And the pandemic changed it a bit. It used to be like 80% to 20% streaming. Now it's about 65-35, but still, CDs still make up the majority of the market. How weird is that in 2025? You know,
I know.
there's some things in Japan that exist that don't exist anywhere else because they simply refuse to change. I mean, I could babble on endlessly, as you're hearing, but you know, people think it's such a modern society. Actually, they still use fax machines. You know, they're actually stuck in a different era because they just refuse to change. You know, and a lot of stuff is still handwritten, and they still have an ink stamp they call a hanko, which they stamp papers with, and this is the only way to get documents done officially is with an ink
Wow.
stamp. You know, there's stuff that could be, you know, 200 years ago in Japan, and that's the way their society is. And we know that their culture is beautiful, and the temples and the, you know,
Oh God, yes.
architecture and the culture and the food is unbelievable.
Yes.
And there's always a flip side. There's always a flip side, you know.
But I must say, I still don't get the appeal of pachinko.
No, most non-Japanese don't. Yeah. We'd have to explain it to people, but I don't even want to explain it. It's just some game that doesn't appeal to us. And not only that, pachinko parlors is like the most unpleasant place in Japan. But that's another story. But it's great that you had those experiences. And of course, I would encourage anybody to visit Japan. And it's, you know, 99.9% likelihood you're going to have an absolutely wonderful time. And yeah, it's you know, and I lived there for 25 years. I mean, I super enjoyed it, and I have had all kinds of experiences, and Japanese people have been incredibly sweet to me. I will end with one thing, just because it's in the same vein of what we were talking about, but maybe you'll understand it. Because of all the cultural things we just talked about, and the nail that stands out gets hammered down, and et cetera, there's another irony. Irony is the theme of this talk. Another irony of Japan is that the people, as I said at the beginning of this question, are the sweetest, most polite, most kind, most thoughtful people that you could possibly imagine. And I'm being completely sincere about that. But Japanese institutions are horrible. How can that be? It's Japanese people who make up the institutions. But Japanese banks are impossible to deal with. You know, all sorts of Japanese institutions are set up for their own good and not for the consumer. And it's very clear in Japan. You have to fit into our system. We're not going to do anything to try and accommodate you. It's so ironic and so bizarre that you have this divergence between the people and their institutions. But what are you going to do?
I know. Well, Rob, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure for me, and I really hope everybody that watched this that hasn't read The Wisdom of Morrie is incentivized to pick up the book and read it, because it will only enhance their lives. And again, thank you for finding it and putting it together and being here today with me. Thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Okay.